Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Natalie Rodriguez and I am with the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, a program of the National Institute of Justice. Before we get started, I will go over how you can view and interact with today's webinar. The first thing I'll draw your attention to is the chat pod, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen next to the player window. The chat is the best way to communicate any questions you have regarding today's material. All questions will be retained until the Q&A session after the presentation. The chat is also the best way to let our support team know if you are experiencing any technical issues. Simply post a short description of the issues you are having and our audience support team will assist you. If for some reason you happen to lose the audio or video during the live stream, the first thing you should do is refresh your web browser and then click the play button in the middle of the player window. If this does not work or you experience any other technical issues, please use the chat to notify our support team. You can also contact us with any customer support issues with the FTCOE toll-free number or email address located directly above the player window. We will begin today's webinar shortly, but first, please take a moment to type your location into the chat so we can get an idea of where everyone is joining us from today, as well as confirm that the chat is working properly.
For today's webinar, we have Dr. Michelle Peace, a forensic toxicologist with a research lab at Virginia Commonwealth University in the Forensic Science Education Programs Accreditation Commission, or FEPAC, accredited Department of Forensic Science, presenting electronic cigarettes, a tangle of regulation, public health, and public safety issues. Without further delay, here's Dr. Peace.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Natalie. I really appreciate the platform that the center provides for us to come together as a community, and I love being able to share what my research team has done at VCU. So what I'm going to be sharing today is a lot of outcomes that have essentially precipitated out of roughly 8 years worth of research at my Laboratory for Forensic Toxicology Research in the Department of Forensic Science. I mean, one of the things that I became very interested in, particularly when I understood how unregulated the electronic cigarette industry was in the early days, was what happened during that period of time that electronic cigarettes were not regulated. And then sort of the tangle of what happened with the cannabis industry as it merged, and what were the public health and public safety issues that also fell out of all of this. So on that note, of course, I always have to pause and say all of the opinions are going to be mine and not those of the National Institute of Justice or the Office of Justice Programs. I have the great fortune of having 4 awards from the National Institute of Justice that have really been focused on characterizing the electronic cigarette and its evolution and impact in terms of vaping substances that are not nicotine. So I do want to start with the history and function of the electronic cigarette, just generally speaking. And again, this really fell out the more I did research and in how these devices worked. It became really clear to me that the reason why the evolution happened was because there is a longer history to these products than what most people probably recognize. And so what's really interesting to me is that the modern electronic cigarette really has its start actually in the late 1800s. There's a whisper of something called a flameless cigarette in a like Harper's Bazaar magazine. But really the first patented device was in 1930, and you'll see here that this version of the e-cigarette, we'll call it an e-cigarette. This was not a device meant for vaping nicotine. This was invented for vaping other substances like tinctures that were popular at the time. If you fast forward to the mid 1960s, big tobacco really was motivated to develop a safer product for the consumption of tobacco. And so what is, I think, important for us to have an appreciation for was that this device existed in the mid 60s, but it wasn't popular. First of all, the cigarettes and smoking a traditional cigarette was still sort of cool. So the reason why Big Tobacco began pushing this version of the electronic cigarette, which was a heat not burn product, was because they had data where they knew that people were developing lung cancer from smoking and developing other disease states. So they knew what the health implications were for smoking tobacco and decided to try to thwart that. But the electronic cigarette in the mid-'60s was a commercial failure, so they dropped the products. You fast forward to the 90s, and there's a lot of conversation about the therapeutic benefit of being able to inhale this aerosol that is this gentle aerosol production, presumably gentle, more gentle for the consumer to actually administer therapeutic drugs, not just asthma inhalers, but other pharmaceuticals. And so the catch for delivering a pharmaceutical, particularly in the mid-'90s, was that we really need to get a single dose into a single puff in order for to promote compliance with therapies. And so this is fundamentally very difficult with most of the pharmaceuticals that were available in the 90s. Now that we're living in a decade where high potency drugs are much more common, then we are in a place where a single dose can be delivered in a single puff. But this research really began in the 90s. VCU, Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology, was doing this research. There were a number of research groups around the country that was actually focused on this. So when we think about the modern electronic cigarette, though, it was really invented by this man named Han Lick. He sold his patent as a very wealthy man now, and he has this very interesting story about how, he literally dreamed of the modern electronic cigarette, and as he emerged through this fog, then he dreamed of the version that is now patented. So the electronic cigarette, his version of it, made its way around the world before it landed in the United States in 2006, 2007, in the Tobacco Expo in Las Vegas, where it won an award for innovative products. Roughly 2007, 2008, we see a couple of countries begin to adopt the electronic cigarette as a tool to help their population of people stop smoking the traditional cigarette. And so this wasn't necessarily based on a lot of robust data. It was it's based on the fact that they have very aggressive policies in place to try to help their citizens reduce their consumption of a traditional cigarette. So they began adopting, New Zealand and Germany began adopting policies that would essentially promote the electronic cigarette to help people stop smoking. One of the challenges here in the United States is that products begin being imported into the United States. And the Food and Drug Administration, seeing all these importations, and there was some early language, of course, about how vaping can help with smoking cessation. So the Food and Drug Administration said, well, we're going to put a stop to all these importations because we regulate tobacco. And so they got immediately sued by a company in China. And the company won this lawsuit because the language in the Food and Drug Administration's language in the regulations was that they oversee tobacco, and an electronic cigarette is not a tobacco product. It is a nicotine delivery device. And so based on that, the Chinese company won their suit, and the Food and Drug Administration just had to fall back and say, well, we need to be able to regulate the e-cigarette. And so they began monitoring the quality of products as they were coming into the United States. So it does take an act for the Food and Drug Administration to be able to move on developing new regulations. And so it wasn't until President Obama signed the Family Smoking Regulation and Tobacco Control Act that the Food and Drug Administration was able to begin developing their regulatory language for the electronic cigarette. So that dropped in May of 2016, those new regulations. And essentially what had happened was that they essentially said that the states that had adopted language, those were good. So the regulations that became immediately effective from the Food and Drug Administration standpoint were policies that individual states had already adopted. And so states had to do something because a 10-year-old could walk into a gas station and buy vaping products. So most states banned the selling electronic cigarette products to anybody under the age of 18 before the Food and Drug Administration's Regulatory Act took place. So by 2019, Congress has essentially adopted the stance that everybody needs to be 21 in order to be able to purchase any kind of product that contains nicotine. And then this is, close enough to our time point right to the present, is that in 2020, President Trump's administration banned flavoring chemicals in these pod-based devices. And so the language was very specific. And so if you go into any kind of shop now, you're going to find lots of e-liquids and pod devices that still contain all of the candy flavored and fruit flavored pods that actually got banned. And so the language is very specific in terms of only banning it for some products. So what wound up happening was that we still have this giant gap, right? So they came into the United States in 2007, and when the FDA is not able to promulgate any kind of regulation until 2016, the industry is going to essentially have a wide space to play in terms of marketing and advertisement and penetration into populations that are buying these devices. So I started thinking a lot about advertisements and how they were actually able to be successful without saying that vaping is a smoking cessation product, because they still can't say that, because smoking cessation imparts a health benefit, and the Food and Drug Administration says that you can't have any claims to that unless it's regulated by them. So you will see here that, again, when you think about subliminal messaging, the Juul pod, who is owned by Altria, who owns Marlboro, you'll see, I thought it was very clever that the shape of their pod device that fits into the Juul is a mimic of the cigarette pack. When companies can't claim that a device can help with smoking cessation, then when they're advertising it, they either tap into a philosophy or a feeling that a product is cool, or you'll see here for Juul that they're not saying that vaping is a smoking cessation device, but it's clearly implied that if you use their product, you'll be able to switch. And so that's really critical language, particularly now for nicotine treatment facilities and tobacco addiction, is that when people move from smoking to vaping, they're just switching. That's not quitting. That's just switching your nicotine consumption. So there's still an addiction there. And so health professionals are really changing their language around that. One of the things that we also keep an eye on is how tobacco companies are still penetrating into young people's lives. And so we know that it's very common to still see back to school sales for vaping products. And we know that the last I checked, that this was still true, that there's one vaping company that is offering scholarships for young people to go to college. But one of the more insidious ways, particularly when it really became obvious that there was lots of marketing towards young people and what the addiction rates were for young people, they went underground in social media. And so what we see here is that companies started offering bonus points that if you, as a teenager, put onto your social media and use their hashtag, that you were vaping their product, then you would receive some kind of points towards a future purchase. And so now you've got the young people doing the hard work for the companies. So we had still continue to see this really wide proliferation. So the FDA's regulations dropped in 2016, and they kept pushing back the deadline for compliance with their regulations. And so they had lots of reasons that weren't all that compelling, honestly, from a public health perspective as to why they were pushing back the regulations. But it was certainly fortuitous for lots of big tobacco companies. So one of the challenges, of course, that we see, not just with their penetration into the lives of young people, but also how they try to change the narrative from a scientific perspective. So one of the really interesting pieces that has fallen out in the last couple of years is that big tobacco scientists are publishing at very high rates in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And so what we see here is that this is in prevention medicine, and then not too long after that, something came out from in the Lancet with regards to the volume of peer-reviewed literature that was biased. And so somebody spent a lot of time unpacking that, and it was actually a fairly outrageous numbers. Like at one point in time, roughly 70% of the literature was all from the tobacco industry, right? And so, it definitely cast a long shadow over robust and objective experimental designs that was happening in, the walls essentially of academia. And so, it's a testimony to the fact that big tobacco was running the narrative still on the fact that they were saying that vaping was safe. So, they have no shame. So they also bought an entire special issue of the American Journal of Health Behavior. That was just this past year, right? And so one of the issues around this is that the reviewers for this journal were not informed that the entire special issue had been purchased by Altria. And so there were a lot of issues around what got accepted and what didn't get accepted. And so this just points out that it's really incumbent upon us as scientists to have a really critical eye when we review manuscripts for the peer-reviewed literature, to always assess, is this manuscript coming from a place of objectivity or bias? So this is just another example. And so this is a manuscript that came out shortly after my research group had published a list of chemicals that were in vaping products, and most of which were hazardous or toxic to lung tissue. And so Juul pushed out this manuscript shortly after we published ours. They do cite us in this. And so essentially their conclusion was there's not as many chemicals in a vaping product as there is in a cigarette. So vaping is still safer. Haha. So the interesting thing about this manuscript is that, in the conflict of interest, they declared none. And clearly we know that, if they're coming out of big tobacco, there's clearly a conflict there. So let's talk about the product evolution. So the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control recognize 4 generations. And so the first generation, the ones that first came over in 2006 or 7, it was this first generation. These were low voltage. These were ones and dones. You can't refill these devices. They actually are purchased like a traditional pack of cigarettes. And users started saying, I want to be able to manipulate my device. I want to be able to recharge my device. I want to be able to put my own e-liquid into my device. So these contain 3 to 5 mils of e-liquid, depending on the configuration of the device. And so now that users are being able to begin to tinker with their products, with their vaping products, now they say, well, let's tinker more. So this led to the 3rd generation. These mods, that stands for modifications. So these are big devices. These are big, thick, chunky devices like the size of your cell phone. And they're completely customizable. You can replace the coils in them, replace the wicks. Of course, you can put your own e-liquid in there. You can adjust the power setting. You can manipulate resistance. And so these were completely customizable. However, they're bulky. So what happened was that now we have a complete reversal. So the fourth generation that is officially recognized are the pod mods. And so Juul fits into this category. And so there are dozens of other pod types of devices that are on the market now. Some of them are pre-filled, some of them are refillable, some are not. And so the pod really facilitates discrete vaping. And it can't stress that issue enough, right? Is that discrete vaping became really the benchmark. And this electronic cigarette was born in the cannabis industry. So one of the things that my research group has been very adamant about is that there's actually 5 generations. So we think the pod mods are the 5th generation, and that the 4th generation are really these devices that are meant for consuming drugs other than nicotine in other than e-liquid form. And so they're called drippers and dab rigs. The CDC and the FDA don't recognize this as a separate generation because they're meant for vaping products that they don't regulate. So what happened for the 4th generation is that people were taking the 3rd generation mods and dripping their drugs directly onto the device, as opposed to putting the drugs directly into an e-liquid, which takes a lot of drug to do that and it's expensive. Might as well just drip directly onto those hot coils. Those coils, when they're dry like that, can reach temperatures of around 1,000 degrees Celsius. So this was inconvenient, right? You got to unscrew the mouthpiece. You got to figure out how to, now you're going to inhale the aerosol that gets generated. So the drippers and dab rigs are essentially a widened mouthpiece. And so this facilitates the user to be able to drip directly through the mouthpiece without screwing it off to for the e-liquid. There are ceramic cups that are meant for herbal material. And then there's also stainless steel cups now for crystals, dabs, waxes, those kinds of products. So the 4th generation, in our opinion, is something that is meant for vaping other kinds of products. Now, the dripper with that wide mouth, it can still be used to vape nicotine. And it is very popular for that, but we can't lose sight of the fact that the reason why these devices were made was so that people could drip other drugs through that mouthpiece. So what we know about the pods is really that at the end of the day, they've become a real nightmare culturally for us, right? Particularly where young people are concealing the consumption of nicotine and other products while they're at school. So the devices are very clever, right? And so again, the reason why they're able to do this was that this technology was born out of the cannabis industry for the concealment of consuming cannabis. So let's talk about how the electronic cigarette works. They all work like this, no matter what the configuration is. And so I'll let the GIF reset. So what happens is the user actually triggers the battery to turn on, either by depressing a button or inhaling. That sends a jolt of energy to the coil. That coil heats up. The coil is wrapped with a wick. That wick contains the e-liquid. So when that coil heats up to 400 degrees Celsius, it immediately evaporates the e-liquid that's on that wick. And as soon as that aerosol hits the colder air, it grabs water out of the air and then condenses into tiny droplets. And so that aerosol cloud is a condensation aerosol. So, of course, we know that it looks like this, right? There are actually vaping contests now in terms of how big and how pretty your cloud can be. But when we think about it scientifically, I think about the size of those droplets, because the size of those droplets actually impact where that drug is going to land in your respiratory tract. So the larger droplets are going to get stuck in your mouth and your throat, and the smaller droplets are actually going to penetrate into the lungs and can make it down to where your alveoli are, where it interfaces with your capillary bed for drug absorption. So there are three regions in the respiratory tract, right? And so the first one, of course, is your extrathoracic. And so droplet sizes that are larger than 5 microns are going to get impacted here. The tracheobronchial region, right, which is really the larger branches of your lung tissue. Droplets that are 2 to 5 microns are going to land here. And then, of course, the pulmonary region is where your alveoli are. And so droplets that are going to be less than 2 microns are going to penetrate all the way to the alveoli, where they're going to hit the walls of the alveoli, and the drug is going to be able to diffuse into the capillary beds. Ultrafine particles also make it into the deep lung tissue where the alveoli are. However, they're so small that they are actually exhaled. So what has happened is that people have said, inhale and hold, which that's not novel, but inhale and hold to give more time for those ultrafine particles to penetrate the walls of the alveoli. So one of the things we did in our lab was we needed to measure the amount of drug in the aerosol. And so this was before there were any kinds of equipment to be able to capture an aerosol out of an e-cigarette. So we did this really not so sexy daisy chained Erlenmeyer flask. We set them in an ice water bath to be able to facilitate the aerosol actually collapsing. And so our flow rate was set at 2.3 liters per minute, which is actually very similar to people who inhale and then exhale. That flow rate of inhaling is roughly 2.3 liters per minute. Our trap has 150 mils of water in it. And so we capture the trap, we wash the tubing, and we analyze by any one of our instruments that is specific to the drug that we're interested in. So when we did this, I was very interested early on in this mythology that people said that if you increase the voltage of the electronic cigarette, you're going to get more drug in the aerosol. And generally speaking, that's true. But what this shows us, and we have done this study multiple times and we get the same results, is that there are wide error bars at every voltage in terms of the amount of nicotine that's in that aerosol. And so what that demonstrates to us is that puff to puff, it is very difficult for the electronic cigarette to put the same amount of drug into that aerosol. So there's a lot of variability. We were very interested in also measuring ethanol. So one of the things that my lab discovered quite serendipitously was that some e-liquids contain a significant amount of ethanol. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And so we did the same experiments. We did a dose capture because there was some concern that, well, the ethanol is evaporating, right? It was like, well, yes, it's evaporating into your mouth. So where you're going to inhale it. And so we actually showed that that was the case, and that the more ethanol that was in the e-liquid, the more ethanol that was actually in the aerosol. So we wanted to then assess particle size, right? So we use this thing we call it the Moody. It's a micro orifice uniform deposit impactor. And so this is really just a sieve that we pass the aerosol through. Big droplets get stuck on the top filter. Smaller droplets will pass through all of those stages. You'll see the 90-degree turn essentially mimics the mouth into the throat. So what we demonstrated here, we changed all kinds of parameters. We changed voltage, we changed resistance, we changed the makeup of the e-liquid, and every single time we were able to demonstrate that it didn't really matter how it changed. The drug was going to make it into the pulmonary tract and into the deep lung tissue where the alveoli are, where there can be drug exchange. So we did the same with the ethanol, right? Because the question was, surely it's not making it to the deep lung tissue. And we were able to demonstrate that indeed it was making it to the deep lung tissue. So let's talk about some public health implications. One of the things that I became particularly interested in was this issue around heavy metals. So we know that there are heavy metals in the aerosol. So the question is, where's it from? We know that e-liquids themselves contain trace amounts of heavy metals because they are interfacing during the manufacturing process with, metal walls of tanks. We also know that there's some stainless steel tanks of the e-cigarettes themselves. And then, of course, the coil is metal, and that coil is getting between 400 and 1,000 degrees Celsius. So we looked at the coils in two different configurations, contact and non-contact. And so these are some SEM pictures of the coils. One is brand new, and then one heat cycle, 50 heat cycles, and then 150. And by the time that coil gets to 150 heat cycles, which is not uncommon, you'll see that the metal from the coil is beginning to flake off. So I'm going to touch very quickly on what is the composition of an e-liquid. So the most common carriers are propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. And so the ratio of those two together really depends on what the user wants their experience to be. So for people who want a large cloud, they'll have more vegetable glycerin in there. For people who would rather have a stronger hit in the back of their throat, there's going to be more PG in there. One of the things that we have seen, particularly with the advent of the cannabis industry and trying to vape cannabinoids, is that the cannabinoids don't dissolve very well in PG or VG. So people are putting the cannabinoids in either PEG or MCTs, medium chain triglycerides, which is coconut oil. And then they are putting that into PG and VG. So that creates its own set of problems. So one of the things that we're seeing now is that they're just jamming the wax dab into the cartridge as opposed to dealing with an e-liquid. We know that there are thousands of flavor combinations, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We know that now the manufacturers are adding all kinds of additives and enhancers, right, to try to stabilize the products. We know that there are organic acids for formulations that are nicotine salts, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And we know that vitamins are being added. Sometimes the vitamins are being used as stabilizers. Sometimes they're being advertised as, hey, you can vape vitamin C and get your daily dose. And that's a complete fallacy. And then, of course, we know that nicotine and other drugs are being consumed in e-cigarettes as well. So the reason why there's so much nicotine in the pods is because it's an organic salt now. And so a standard e-liquid of the free-base nicotine, about our limit of tolerating a free-base nicotine is about 18 milligrams. And so pods can be anywhere from 40 to 70 milligrams in a single pod. And so that's more than what is in an entire pack of cigarette. And the reason why they do that is when nicotine is in the salt form, we're able to tolerate it much better. Like I said previously, one of the things that we really waved the flag pretty hard on when we discovered this was that some e-liquids contain significant amount of ethanol. So it's not surprising that they contain a little bit because a lot of flavorants are in ethanol. But for an e-liquid to contain more than 10% ethanol, that was shocking. And so even today, we have seen some products contain as much as 30% by weight per volume of ethanol. And so this is some unpublished data out of our lab where we were also curious as to what is in pods. And so we are seeing that some non-Altria, non-Juul pods do contain as much as 20% ethanol as well in that little pod. One of the things that was particularly interesting came to us was a school came and said, we think our kids are putting cocaine into their e-liquids. And so we asked, well, can we see some of those? And we'll evaluate to see what's happening. And so I'm going to point this one out particularly because of the unlabeled ingredient that's in here that caught my eye. So, of course, it has glycerin and nicotine in it. We've got lots of flavoring chemicals in here. It has menthol in it, which was the shocker for us. This was a blueberry flavored e-liquid. And what we know is that flavorants like menthol, cooling agents, are put in as an unlabeled ingredient because it facilitates the hold. So it's easier on the mouth, it's easier on the throat, easier in the lung when it has that cooling agent in there. And so it facilitates people inhaling and holding, which then in turn facilitates nicotine addiction. So we were, of course, very concerned about this. So we know right now that there's legislation to ban all menthol, but the legislation is specific to menthol. There are dozens of other cooling agents that we have begun to identify. And so what we see here is that this product is the organic acid for the nicotine salt is lactic acid. And then, of course, some other byproducts. So what we have here is, now I'm worried about Juul. Now I'm thinking about it. Previously, I wasn't. And so this case came to me where there was a whistleblower inside of Juul who said that Juul did not retract 1 million tainted pods. And so the CEO of Juul at the time said, they don't know what they're vaping anyways, so don't recall them. And so I took a look at the tests that they ran on a handful of the tainted pods, and they were black. Then they had separation in them. There was clearly something visibly wrong with these. But the test that they ran on them, there was no way that they could have ever gotten as to what they were contaminated with. So this is that data. And so you'll see here that the measures that they did on it was refractive index, density, specific gravity, and pH. There's no way that Juul could have known how and with what their those Juul pods were tainted with. So we began monitoring Juul because of this, and so we purchased Juul products from multiple sources. And one flavor in particular we discovered has GBL in it, which is the prodrug to GHB, and it's an industrial solvent. So it's, in some regards, it's not surprising, but it was consistently in one flavor in all the pods of that flavor we tested. Which leads me to say we have a challenge with labeled versus unlabeled ingredients. And so the industry sort of has gotten away with the fact that they've said, well, we're using products that are considered GRAS, generally regarded as safe. And so this is the FDA designation for chemicals that are safe to eat. And so this does not mean that they are safe to inhale. So almost every chemical that we have identified is some kind of toxin, hazard, or irritant to lung tissue. So one of the issues that came up when the FDA kept pushing the brake on setting their regulations into gear for compliance was that they got sued by a anti-tobacco group. A U.S. federal judge said, listen, FDA, you've got to get it into gear and get those going. And then just a couple of weeks after they did that, then we see the 8 teenagers in Milwaukee that were hospitalized with severe lung injury. So this began the epidemic of the summer of 2019. The FDA and the CDC were essentially pointed their finger at vitamin E or vitamin E acetate. And what we do know is that the CDC is no longer collecting this data. I am on a couple of blogs for public health, and so there are still people that are reporting with severe lung injury. And so at the end of the day, the question really becomes, if all of these chemicals are hazards and irritants, then they all can be a potential source of damage to that deep lung tissue, even PG and VG, which tend to be hygroscopic. Right. And so they're going to absorb that very fine layer of water that's in the deep lung tissue and cause injury. So we know when there's that kind of injury, then the alveoli begins to separate from the capillary bed, and there's going to be this infusion of an immune response there. So the CDC said it was likely vitamin E, and I'm going to contend that most any chemical can cause EVALI. And so there's plenty of data in the literature that says that we should have been aware that this was going to happen, right? Where there are plenty of clinical studies that said that people were complaining about airway irritation, and inflammatory responses. And just before the EVALI outbreak, they did demonstrate that in an animal model that the animals did develop acute lipid pneumonia, which is very similar to the outcome for some of those patients that had EVALI. So I went back and reviewed in our database of chemicals which ones were hazards and which ones weren't, and most of them were hazards. So one of the other things that we also monitor, which is really why the National Institute of Justice funded us, was to evaluate substance use, that is the consumption of other drugs. And so we did this, we sent out this survey out on Reddit and other social media platforms. And we just asked people, what are you vaping? And so, of course, we knew that cannabinoids were going to be at the very top. But what we also see here is that they're vaping all kinds of things, from DMT to herbal substances and kratom. And so the last one, we had one person say they were vaping THC, CBD, Xanax, ketamine, LSD, Vivance, and coffee. We have received a number of cases in the lab. This was a case where a young man showed up at VCU Health System's emergency department, and he was putting this into his e-liquids. And so it turns out that it was an herbal product, apomorphine and luciferin. He did survive, but that was a fairly scary time for him. We do monitor other kinds of herbal products as well, because vaping these products, there's no real indication as to how you should be consuming these products. So they do come with lots of warnings on them. And if an e-liquid looks expensive online, then we usually purchase that. So we do monitor this man who runs this shop in Asia. I can't remember what country, the Philippines, I believe. And so he's very proud of how he manufactures herbal products to put into e-liquids and other formulations. We know that people understand that kratom cock and kratom na is actually kratom. And so we did go down the street and purchase some kratom products. And so we found nicotine, metrageny, and 7-hydroxy in that. And just to put an exclamation point on the fact that there's no good advice as to how to consume these herbal products. And so Speciosa Guide is actually meant to give people advice as to how to consume kratom. And I certainly wish I had screenshot this. I dashed this off in some notes. But in 2017, which is just prior to this young man dying from vaping kratom, the advice on Speciosa Guide was, if you are used to eating 4 grams of metrageny, you should smoke 40. So we have also monitored lots of other e-liquids. These are products that we purchased. I want to say they were roughly $50 each. And you'll see that drug is in crystalline form in the bottom of the e-liquids. These contained MDMB Fubinaca. We know that people are trying to put opioids into their e-liquids. And so there is some advice to mix them with caffeine to facilitate that. And so I thought, well, why are they doing that? And I thought, oh, a eutectic mixture. So if you put 2 chemicals together, it reduces their boiling point. And so when it reduces their boiling point, it facilitates that aerosol generation. And so this is actually founded in a manuscript in 1987, where they evaluated cutting agents with heroin, and also noted that the recovery of the drug when it was combined with a diluent was actually higher than when the drug was on its own. So when we did that, we looked at nicotine and methadone, and when we combined them in a 1-to-1 ratio, you'll see there that the amount of drug in the aerosol almost doubled. We do a lot of product surveillance as well. So this was a product, Diamond CBD, that we purchased randomly off of their website and discovered out of the 9 products, 4 contained 5-fluoro-ADB and 1 contained dextromethorphan. The CEO of Diamond CBD was really angry with me, not surprisingly. So now what he does is he sends a random batch, random sampling off this batch to this lab for it to be quality tested. Nowhere in this is a targeted list. Nowhere on this list will you find 5-fluoro-ADB or dextromethorphan. But then he did say he went back to the batch we purchased out of and said that it contained mostly melatonin, which is still a lie. We then started getting in lots of products. That went national. It hit popular media. So we started getting lots of products from people saying that they had really, really adverse reactions when they consumed a product. And all of these patients were taking CBD for therapeutic benefit, right? From anywhere from anxiety to joint pain. And so you'll see here that in this list that most of the products contained some synthetic cannabinoid, but 3 of them were just CBD. And so this really rang the bell for me that we don't know what other drugs these people were on. So 2 of those 3 women that just took CBD were over the age of 70 and were taking other prescription pharmaceuticals. And then one person was a diabetic who was taking CBD for leg pain. And so also on other prescription pharmaceuticals. And so we don't know if there was a drug-drug interaction, or we just don't know if they had an experience. They were naive users. And so we don't know if they just had an experience that was unexpected and then got scared. So, it really underscores the fact that we need to have good community education around cannabinoids. One of the things that is particularly consuming for me are these rise of these new unnatural THC isomers, these analogs. So I'm just going to populate the whole screen here. So what we see here, of course, we all know about delta-8 THC. That is an isomer of delta-9. It's actually an isobar. It's different by the position of one double bond. But we also know that delta-10, also an isobar, is a different double bond position. But THCO has an acetate group. THCP has a 7-member side chain as opposed to a 5. And so there's lots of language in shops and online about the advent of these, that THCO is, can be 100 times more potent and hallucinogenic than delta-9, and THCP is even more than that. So there's some concern about all of these products, and we don't do a very good job delineating when somebody has an adverse reaction, what is actually in the product that they took. So Michigan Poison Control Center issued a warning about their products. This was a picture of a sign that I took in a shop here in Central Virginia. And so, saying that delta-8 is like CBD, and we know that it's not like CBD, but they're trying to sell product. And we know that delta-8 arose because there was a glut of CBD in the market, and the prices had crashed. And so you don't want to throw all that away. So a very easy chemical process converts it to delta-8. For THCP, we see here that people know that this is a very powerful cannabinoid. And so in this situation, you'll see that they're saying, don't make big decisions or babysit while using this product. And then yet another company who got really concerned about the efficacy, the hallucinogens of THCP, they've actually pulled it from their shelves. So some of the things I think a lot about is that in the late 1800s, the reason why, the Food and Cosmetic Act was stood up to say, you can't make false claims like cancer can be cured from these tinctures, or you take this snake oil and it's going to cure everything from whooping cough to toenail fungus. You can't make those claims. And so here we are in the present day, and with the cannabis industry, we're saying very much the same, is that, there was in the early days of COVID, there were lots of claims that THC and CBD could cure COVID. We know that there was this public health alert that went out about fentanyl-laced marijuana. For the most part, we know that those were actually false, that it was actually determined that the marijuana was not laced with fentanyl. There is one case out there right now that is still, I think, under investigation. But the concern is that now we have adulterations. We have an unregulated industry, much like we did in the late 1800s. We have an unregulated cannabis industry. And we know that products are being laced with all kinds of synthetic cannabinoids and also with these new unnatural THC isomers. So in terms of my overarching concerns, in terms of our responsibilities as a scientist, is that having an appreciation that regulations and oversight of products, we really need those. And we need those pushed out. We need those supported. The regulatory industry agencies need to have resources to be able to enforce those regulations. And there needs to be a lot of community education because we certainly know that the e-cigarette companies, big tobacco, and then the cannabis companies, big cannabis, have been running the narrative. And they conduct these small research projects and then they blog about it. And so they're able to blog about it. They can't advertise it. And so they're pushing research out as marketing. And what it does is it degrades the public trust when a scientist comes along and actually does the robust research. And then it counters what big tobacco and big cannabis have been saying all along. So I do believe we have to come together as a community so that we can have some rapid response and research. And so my research team is always happy to help answer questions or partner for education and research moving forward. So I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, RTI, and your efforts to put on the workshop. Thank you so much to our workshop coordinators for the Academy and putting on a great workshop. So thank you once again for the platform. And by all means, you can reach out to me with questions beyond here if we don't get them answered in the next few minutes. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peace, for that very informative presentation. Today we have guest moderator Chip Walls, independent consultant in forensic technology. Take it away, Chip.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Peace, for your excellent presentation. This is a very complicated and complex issue, and we need to bring to bear all of the forensic science expertise to try to answer some of these questions. And there are a number of questions, and I'm thinking Dr. Peace has access to the questions.
I do. Yes. Thank you, Chip. I really appreciate you being my moderator. So I can actually see the questions. So the first question is, with the ethanol levels at 20%, does that change the blow factors when stopped for DUIs? This is a fantastic question. That's actually the nature of the clinical study that I'm conducting right now. So we have participants come into our clinic and they vape different concentrations of ethanol in e-liquids. And so we're partnered with the VCU Police Department and the Center for the Study of Tobacco Products for this. And so preliminary data is indicating that as long as an officer is abiding by the 15 to 20 minute observation period before they administer the preliminary breath test, then that PBT will not be positive. If the data is showing that a blow on the PBT immediately after vaping does indicate ethanol presence. Again, as long as the 15 to 20 minute wait period is being observed, then there's not an issue there. And our study demonstrated that we use an intoxilizer as the EBT, and there was no interference with the intoxilizer.
That 20-minute period is critical.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The next question, what flavor pods?
So the flavor pods that had the GBL for Juul was one flavor, Virginia tobacco. So Juul, after the Trump administration banned flavors, they dropped down to only 3 flavors, Juul did. So it's tobacco, Virginia tobacco, and menthol. And so Virginia tobacco contained the GBL.
Important to note that GBL is not controlled in most states, but it is a precursor chemical, which should be appreciated that precursor chemicals such as GBL are converted to GHB in the human body, and then that becomes a intoxicant.
Yeah, it's true. We were in the manuscript, we discuss our concerns about people microdosing GBL.
Microdosing is a very popular term in psychedelics these days. I wonder how it applies to GBL because it is generally a very low dose chemical solvent if you inhale it or ingest it.
Correct.
There's been a between vape and e-cigarettes.
I'm sorry?
The next question is, has there been any correlation between vape e-cigarette users?
Oh, with COVID. Yes.
Yes.
So some of the data that emerged essentially during lockdown, there were lots of warnings early on that if you were a smoker, you were susceptible to developing some of the more severe health problems from contracting COVID. Then pretty quickly that language evolved to if you smoked or vaped, then you would be more susceptible to some of the severe lung injuries that came along with COVID-19. So yes, that correlation has been made.
There are a number of emergency room reports considering the overlap between vaping and COVID-19 symptoms. It has been vapors may not be easily distinguished in the emergency room, causing complications in diagnosis and treatment.
Yeah. Yeah, some of the challenges I think culturally around vaping is that not a lot of physicians are really asking. I don't say nobody is, but but that's a cultural shift to say if we're going to ask about smoking behavior, we should also ask about vaping.
Please, another question. Do you use your data to help educate teens, kids about potential harmful effects?
Yeah, I do. I'm usually either on the road or doing a webinar every couple of weeks. And these are then shared with community members. So whether it's school systems, school resource officers, nurses, administrators. So yeah, so the research is we have cast a pretty wide net to try to educate communities.
Another question I have as a moderator, have you had a chance to look at any of the new things called puffs, the disposable electronic cigarettes that contain who knows what?
Oh, yes. So we have a current research project where we're taking a look at that. And so what's interesting about the puff bar is that one of the reasons why you still see a lot of flavored pod systems on the market is because they were saying, well, we use synthetic nicotine, not nicotine extracted from the tobacco plant. So therefore, these products don't fall under the FDA regulations. So we don't know that that's actually the case, but they claimed that. We know that in March of this year, just a couple of months ago, Congress signed an omnibus package that essentially put synthetic nicotine under the FDA into the FDA regulatory language. So we don't know where that's going to go, but we do have a project where we are looking at vapes that are confiscated out of middle schools and high schools. And we're conducting the research, the analyses right now, the untargeted analyses to determine what those chemical profiles are of those products, those disposable products that kids actually do have easy access to.
That's a very important point, the untargeted, because so many of these e-liquids have to be examined completely as opposed to targeted analysis.
Correct. Correct. It's a giant job, but it has to be done.
It's a very expensive job. I think Dr. Peace would also seek other forms of reimbursement to do these studies, because it's very, I mean, in one study that was reported recently, there were over 20,000 different flavored solutions that were in e-pods.
Correct. Yeah, it's a giant job and not our main focus, but we still do it because, somebody has to do it.
Absolutely, because if we don't have the data, we're sort of flying blind in the battle against these multi-billion-dollar industries of e-cigarettes and cannabinoids. I think Dr. Peace had to leave at 2 p.m. If you have any questions that we may be able to help, you can shoot us emails to our emails that are on the screen, and we will try to get you the information that might answer your questions.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Dr. Peace and Chip. If you have any further questions, please contact their emails. Have a great day.
Before you leave today's webinar, please participate in our short 5-minute survey. Simply click the checkbox icon directly above the chat to access the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback is critical information that helps us improve our webinars and continue providing the best experience possible. We would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. There is also a link to the FDCOE website, the Just Science podcast, and the FDCOE newsletter registration. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FDCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.